Get this, adults with financial literacy skills have 82% more wealth than those who don't. From swimming lessons to piano classes, us parents invest in so many things to enrich our kids' lives. But are we investing in their future financial success? With Greenlight, you can teach your kids financial literacy skills like earning, saving, and investing. And this investment costs less than that after-school treat. Start prioritizing their financial education and future today with a risk-free trial at greenlight.com/Wondery. Greenlight.com/Wondery.
This is a mini meditation guided by Bombas. Repeat after me. I'm comfy. I'm cozy. I have 0 blisters on my toes. And that's because I wear Bombas, the softest socks, underwear, and t-shirts that give back. One purchased equals one donated. Now go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Prosecutors Podcast is brought to you by Progressive, home of the Name Your Price tool. You say how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. It's easy to start a quote. Visit Progressive.com to get started. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Jennifer Harris disappeared from Bonham, Texas on Mother's Day 2002. The secrets in the Jennifer Harris case have been hidden for 20 years.
When someone disappears, you have to look at who would benefit from their disappearance.
What happened to Jennifer Harris? And who is responsible for her death? Coming May 10th, Final Days on Earth, Season 2, The Life and Death of Jennifer Harris. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we conclude our look at the Dammion Heard case. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my sublime co-host, Alice.
Sublime. Look at you. You have like a new treasure trove of words after we got back from CrimeCon.
People had a lot of words at CrimeCon,
They
and
did.
I was taking notes.
That was so fun. People would run up to me and like not even say hi, and just be like, "I have a word," and I was like, "Maybe you should tell Brett." No, I'm just kidding. It was so fun. It was so fun for people to run up to us. I know we already talked about CrimeCon last week, but I'm still glowing over how fun it was to meet so many people.
I know, maybe one day people will say nice things about me. I can dream, I guess.
Say nice things. Oh, do you want me to flip it? Brett, you are bodaciously awesome.
Bodaciously awesome. I like that. Okay. That's pretty good.
I mean, I just came up with that. Can you believe that?
You just off the top of your head. That was amazing.
Off the top of my head.
You don't even have a
the first
list
thing
like I do.
thought about bodacious Brett.
Oh, man. Well, Alice, we can't dilly-dally today because we were supposed to do Dammion Heard in 2 episodes, and we didn't do that. We did not finish in 2, so we got to do 3. And we still have a lot to cover. There's a lot to cover in this case. So, you know, I'm just saying.
Okay. This time, you're right. Last time, we started the episode by saying we'll finish, and I was like, I don't think so. But this time, we are committed. Let's do this, Brett.
We're definitely finishing today, which is not to say that this case doesn't deserve 3 episodes. It absolutely does. And if you want to hear even more about Dammion Heard's case, you can check out Final Days on Earth, which is a podcast dedicated entirely to this case and goes into even more detail about it than we're going to go into it today and in all our episodes. To recap for you where we're at, we have this tragedy. And it's a tragedy no matter what happened. The death of Dammion Heard, a young man, a wrestler in college with his whole life ahead of him. And he's found dead, hanging from a tree by some jumper cables that came from his own car. And the question has been, is this a murder staged to look like a suicide, or is it a suicide? And we've been going through the evidence and some of the sort of unusual things about this case and the timeline. And there's more to talk about. And as we've said from the beginning, the thing you need to be thinking about as you hear each piece of evidence is which way does it cut? Does it cut in favor of a murder, or does it cut in favor of a suicide? Because we do want to get to truth here, and I think it really matters. And it matters for Dammion, and it matters for his family. And today, at the end of this, we're going to talk about the 2 options about what happened, and we'll sort of recap the evidence we've gone through. But for now, let's talk about the holdback evidence in this case and how maybe it wasn't as held back as you wish it was.
So, Brett, we've talked a lot about holdback evidence in past episodes, but if you're just joining us now, holdback evidence is just the term to describe evidence that the police or the investigators are holding back from public knowledge in order to be able to verify if someone confesses, or to, if they're interviewing someone, they can kind of measure up the veracity of what that person is saying because they have non-public information to test their information. So we've talked about this before. If a person comes in and says, I killed this person and I killed them by shooting them in the head, and the police had held back how the person died, and the victim was in fact strangled to death, that holdback evidence allows the police to rule out, or at least seriously doubt, that person's quote-unquote confession. So holdback evidence, the hard part is we never really know as the public what's being held back. We can generally assume, well, if they don't go into detail about how the manner of death, then that might be holdback evidence. But sometimes it can be even more nuanced than that. Not specifics, but maybe the color of clothing or the position of, jewelry or something like that. And in this particular case, we mentioned the jumper cables that Dammion was hanging from, but the police did not, at least initially, talk about the jumper cables. And this was because this was their holdback evidence. And yet, on April 9th, Andrew Morris, one of Kyle Piat's roommates, told police that he'd heard a rumor that Dammion was beaten up and hung from jumper cables. The police were never able to determine how exactly this information got out. However, even though they had publicly held back the information, there were enough officers and enough members of Dammion's family who had been told about the jumper cables that it's possible this information was simply leaked. And it's not that Andrew or some other, college member or any college student had knowledge to know it was the jumper cables.
And I think this is an example of a small town police department kind of messing this up, because this was pretty important information. It was information the police meant to hold back for exactly this reason, because if it were true that no one knew and it was just the police very close to the investigation, a few of the people who'd been there, maybe the coroner, like that level of secrecy, and you have someone who comes in and says that, then all of a sudden you're thinking, maybe this wasn't a suicide. Maybe this was a murder, and that's how this information got out. But they didn't do that. It was quote-unquote holdback evidence, but all these people knew. And it seems like in a small town like this, it got around pretty quickly, and to the frustration of the lead detective in this case, who thought this could have been a big break, but it turned out it really wasn't. Let's talk more about Tori Boyle. We've talked about Tori before. She is the girl who Dammion was texting with the night of the party, and he wanted her to come over to the party. She eventually did, right before Dammion disappeared. And some of the most important evidence in this case may come from Tori Boyle. Now, she was one of Dammion's good friends, and according to her, on at least 2 separate occasions, Dammion had talked to Tori about suicide and suicidal thoughts that he was having. When he had these conversations with her, she had talked him through these and had sort of gotten him out of this malaise that he was in and gotten him to put aside these thoughts. Now, she said that she never actually thought he would follow through with it, but given what happened, it's pretty significant that this is something that Dammion discussed with Tori.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly significant, Brett. Even if Tori thought it was not possible for Dammion to carry out with what he had talked to her about, the fact that he would even verbalize to another person about his thoughts on suicide are very significant. Obviously, it's 2020 hindsight, but we oftentimes see these as warning signs, again, in hindsight, but verbalizing is a big step for him. And I think it's very significant, too, that he does actually reach out to Tori the night of the party, but he doesn't, and he keeps telling her to come. He reaches out to Tori and keeps telling her to come. He doesn't say anything of significance in his text to Tori, but he keeps saying, are you coming to the party? Are you coming to the party? And when she finally does decide to come to the party and he sees her there, he doesn't actually spend much time with her at all. I think that's significant because Dammion obviously knows that he has verbalized his thoughts about suicide to Tori before. And if in fact Dammion had made up his mind that night, that this was the night he was going to end his life, he may be so determined that he doesn't want to be talked out of it. And certainly someone who has heard him verbalize these thoughts before and has talked him out of those thoughts before would, I think, try to repeat talking him out of it again that night were he to talk with her. But oftentimes we find that people who may be having these suicidal ideations avoid those they know who could be capable of talking them out of it if they have set their minds to it. And I don't know if that's what happened that night, but I think it's pretty significant that he keeps telling Tori to come, and when she actually does come, he spends almost no time with her.
I think you're 100% right. I think if you lean towards suicide as the theory here, this is incredibly significant because Dammion has this relationship with her that when he's had these thoughts before, he's talked to her about them and they've worked through them. And you have Dammion texting her, wanting her to come to the party. 12:53 a.m. is one of the last texts he sends, and it's to her. He doesn't think she's going to come to the party, and he says, sucks for you, LOL, right? I mean, projecting this sort of happy view. But then she decides to come. And when she gets there, Dammion, he's laying on the floor, and she says that after all this, wanting her to come, he's got this sweatshirt over his head, and he just says he's tired. And they take that to mean he's going to go to sleep. And you just wonder if this was really significant, if initially when he wanted her to come over, it was to talk him out of whatever he was thinking about doing, but by the time she got there, had he decided, no, I don't want to talk to her because she will talk me out of it. And I've sort of committed and I don't want to be talked out of it. It's really hard to say. Now, it's interesting. Dammion's dad thinks that Tori is lying about this. He thinks she's lying about Dammion having these conversations with her. And he says that for a couple reasons. One of the reasons is Tori had told the police that when she talked to Dammion on one of these occasions, that he had mentioned something along the lines that he was depressed because he wasn't going to get to go home for Christmas. And in fact, this wasn't true. He was going to get to go home for Christmas. And Dammion's dad sort of grabbed onto this as a sign that she's lying. A couple things about that. Number one, that's a really weird thing to lie about. That really sounds much more like a mistake or misunderstanding. Or maybe Dammion said that for reasons that are unclear. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing Tori would lie about. Now, if you think she's lying because she's in on it, she knows about the murder and she's trying to influence the police to make them believe this is suicide, note that she says she did not think he would go through with it and she didn't think he was suicidal that night. And she didn't see any indication that he was in that mindset. If she were lying for the purpose of throwing off the police, she would say, yeah, when I saw him, it was the most depressed I'd ever seen him. That's what she would say if she were going to lie. I don't think she's lying about this. And some people have pointed out that she's the only person that he apparently talked about this with. I actually don't think that's that unusual. I think sometimes there are just certain people in your life, they're not even the people necessarily you're the closest to, that you can tell things that you can't tell to anybody else, just for whatever reason. In fact, if you're not the closest to them, that might actually be better in some circumstances. And I kind of feel like she was that person for Dammion.
Yeah, Brett, that's really insightful there. And I don't see the purpose of Tori lying, like you said. And oftentimes people are quick to jump to say, well, there's an inconsistency in their story or they're lying, but it's also very important to think, why would they lie? What does it benefit them? What would they get out of it? In this case, it doesn't really make any sense for her to tell that particular lie. Now, we could be wrong, of course, but I'm not seeing the purpose or the grander scheme of why she would tell this particular lie.
And while she may have been the only person that he had expressly stated that he was having suicidal thoughts, she's not the only person who knew that Dammion was struggling with some things and was worried about him. Marlena Romero, his ex-girlfriend, when she heard that Dammion's body had been found, she went to the police and she told them that she believed Dammion may have killed himself. And she revealed that during their relationship, they had often talked about their emotional struggles, and she had confided in him some of her own depression, and he had reciprocated. She said that Dammion had been struggling with being away from home and the pressures of school. The only place he found any respite was in wrestling, and the season was over. He'd been struggling with an injury that had prevented him from even completing the season. And he'd been struggling with how to deal with the other pressures of his life without wrestling, which was the one thing that really centered him. And it was a problem for him. And it made Marlena think, when she heard that the body had been found, that this might have been suicide. Last week, we talked about the track team and how there's really no evidence whatsoever the track team's involved in this at all. So if you think it's a murder and you eliminate the track team, unless you think this is just a random act of violence, you're going to be looking at the wrestling team. It would seem like the wrestling team would be the entity that might be responsible for Dammion's death, and that has led people to ask where Kyle Piatt was the night that Dammion disappeared. Now, according to Kyle, he had left his house at around 1 a.m. to attend another party, a football party, that was being held just down the road, returning around 3 o'clock. This timeline has been thrown into dispute by a lot of people. One thing I want to say before we even get into how it's been in dispute, Alice mentioned last time, everybody's drinking, it's a party night, timelines are going to be all over the place. So it may be the case that Kyle did go to the football party, either didn't stay as long as he thought, or went at a different time. But what we do know is that Courtney Birch, who is another person at the party and is one of the roommates, said that she had talked to Kyle until around 2:30 a.m. Now, an interesting thing about Courtney's statement is she never saw Dammion during that time. That would be consistent with what we know about Dammion leaving the party before 2 o'clock, walking to get his car, and being spotted about 15 minutes to 2 at a gas station putting gas into his car. Several other witnesses at the party would confirm that Kyle was around basically the entire time they were there, well into the night. And it would seem like, as I said, Kyle's either wrong about leaving for the party, he wasn't gone as long as you would think, or possibly he had lied to distance himself from whatever happened to Dammion. Now, here's why that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Kyle being at the house with a lot of witnesses seems like a pretty good alibi. Kyle leaving and disappearing, that, on the other hand, would seem to cast suspicion upon him. So the fact that he seems to be there around other people, talking to them, and not, say, killing Dammion somewhere, would seem to indicate that he's probably not involved in whatever happened to Dammion.
Yeah, Brett. I mean, timelines are going to be really difficult between the 1 and 3 a.m., or really any time after midnight. But the fact that we can piece together certain people talking with Kyle, along with, we can piece together Courtney speaking with Kyle, and we know where Dammion was at a certain time because of the gas station security video, helps us to see the timeline in kind of clearer detail, even if the witnesses of that night have murky timelines themselves. That is fully to be expected, which is why that security footage is so helpful, because there are timestamps on that video and we know how far that gas station is from where Dammion came from, and the fact that he didn't have a car, that his car was actually at his house and he had not driven his car to the party. This builds in time for us to kind of build around known time stamps within a murky timeline.
The timestamp on that video with Dammion buying gas, I mean, it blows a huge hole in a lot of theories in this case. It frankly prevents a lot of theories from even being possible. In order for this to be a murder and it to be someone that Dammion was involved with, remember, we have his phone. And we know when contact from Dammion cut off. So it's not as if Dammion's texting Kyle or anybody else and saying, hey, meet me down by the flagpole and let's finish this. I mean, none of that happens. So Dammion leaves this party, walks to campus, gets his car in the middle of the night after partying, drinking, taking LSD, smoking some marijuana, drives to a gas station and gets gas in the middle of the night. Now, the idea that he would then just drive back to his dorm or drive back to the wrestling house where he's planning on going to sleep is patently absurd. There's no way he would do that. He clearly is going somewhere when he buys that gas. That's the only reason he'd buy the gas, is because he probably was almost out of gas, and if he was going to get anywhere, he needed to put some gas in his tank, and so that's what he did. Now, possibly he's going to meet somebody somewhere. I mean, that is a theory that some people have, and it's possible, but it's something he would have had to have planned ahead of time. Because, like I said, there's no use of the phone. And the fact that we know he left the wrestling house alive. At least once, he left alive and got his car. And if you think something happened to him at the wrestling house, it had to happen after that. He had to come back. And then something happened. And then he ends up on the trail. And that gas station footage, I mean, it is so important in this case.
Brett, we've got a very different kind of sponsor for this episode, the Jordan Harbinger Show, which is a podcast you really should be listening to. And I know that every day somebody tells you that you just have to listen to some podcast, and you nod and say, sure, and then you never listen to it. Don't let that happen here. Jordan's show, which Apple named one of its best of 2018, is aimed at making you a better informed, more critical thinker so you can get a sense of how the world actually works and how to come to your own conclusions about what's happening even inside your own brain. Check out some recent episodes like How to Ask for a Promotion and Get It, and my personal favorite, What Happens When Your Stalker's Sister is Dating Your Brother. These are really interesting episodes that we think you will love.
That's the kind of question you want to run out and find the answer to as soon as possible. And those are the kind of shows you're going to hear on Jordan's podcast. He is always focused on pulling useful, practical insights out of his brilliant guests. And we're not talking about pop psychology or wishy-washy self-help stuff. The episodes are loaded with bits of wisdom that you can use to legitimately change your mind and improve your life right away. If that's not worth checking out, I'm not sure what is. We really enjoyed this show, and we think you will as well. Search for The Jordan Harbinger Show. That's H-A-R-B as in boy, I-N as in Nancy, G-E-R on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. The Prosecutors Podcast is brought to you by Progressive. Hey guys, whether you love true crime or comedy, celebrity interviews, news, or even motivational speakers, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue, right? And guess what? Now you can call the shots on your auto insurance too. Enter the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. The Name Your Price tool puts you in charge of your auto insurance by working just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, then they'll show you a variety of coverages that fit within your budget, giving you options.
Now that's something you'll want to press play on. It's easy to start a quote and you'll be able to choose the best option for you fast. It's just one of the many ways you can save with Progressive Insurance. Quote today at progressive.com to try the Name Your Price tool for yourself and join the over 27 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Well, then let's talk about Dammion's injuries, because Dammion's injuries are interesting in the sense that he has none. If he were murdered, it was done without leaving any sort of obvious injury on his body. The only injury he had was the ligature itself. Now, this is really important. I know you may be thinking, well, Dammion knows how to fight because Dammion is a wrestler. So he is used to either getting out of chokeholds or fighting in a manner that doesn't leave signs on your body, right? Wrestling, you don't come out with a bunch of scratches. You're supposed to be using positioning in order to gain sort of an upper hand on your opponent. It is not done by scratching and gouging. However, even if Dammion knew how to fight in a way that didn't leave marks, you do not fight in the way that you are trained for competition purposes when you are fighting for your life. You claw, and there are no rules when it's your life or death, right? And so the fact that Dammion has nothing that would indicate a struggle is very surprising because of the very fact that he is trained to be able to fight and to fight effectively, even if he is smaller than his attacker, if he had an attacker who was larger than him. So you would expect to see something, scrapes, DNA of the attacker under his fingernails. Let's say he was caught completely unawares. You still expect to see some sort of fighting back because likely there was a struggle if he were murdered. Likely he did not drop on the spot because he were, chloroformed. I think you would see, likely they'd be able to see some sort of indication of that, but it's just very unlikely that when you are attacked, you have zero time to fight back. And Dammion knows how to fight back, but we don't see any sign of injury except for what the police believe killed him, which is hanging by the jumper cables.
And this is another place where that video is so important. I mean, one theory some people have posited is right after the fight, there's testimony by some folks that Kyle had him in a headlock or maybe a chokehold. And now the actual testimony is it wasn't much of a chokehold. He just kind of had him loosely where he couldn't get back into the fight. It wasn't that big a deal. But some people said, well, maybe he really had him in a chokehold and the chokehold, he just held it too long and he passed out and then he died and then they had to do something about it. Well, that didn't happen at that point. We know that because lots of people saw Dammion, and we have video of Dammion. Dammion left. So really, you would have to think that at some later point, somebody managed to sneak up on him, put him in some sort of chokehold, that he, without scratching at their arm or fighting back at all, is rendered unconscious, and then they just continue to hold this chokehold until he dies. And then they have to cover it up by staging the death. I mean, you have to believe something like that happened. And once again, no chokehold is instantaneous. It's going to take at least a couple seconds for you to lose consciousness. And in that time, like Alan said, you'd be scratching and gouging and everything else. Dammion's, his fingernails should be full of DNA evidence, whoever did that. Their arms should be covered in scratches. We don't see that. So then you would have to think that Dammion's just so incapacitated. He's so high, or he's so drunk, or he's completely out of it on LSD that someone could kill him and he would never fight back. But the problem is, once again, that video of him putting gas in his car, everyone agrees that he does not appear to be impaired really in any way at that point, that he seems completely lucid. So the idea that the drugs have such a hold on him that he wouldn't fight back just seems completely implausible. And the lack of injuries in that video, man, it just makes it really hard to come up with a way that this could be a murder. And it wasn't just the Gunnison Police Department that thought that.
Yeah, whatever theory you need, you have to take into account that video because that is just such definite evidence that we have there. And it's helpful to have those pieces of evidence within a case like this, right? It's like when you play Wheel of Fortune and there are those letters on the board, or Wordle, Brett, I know you play a lot of Wordle, where you know exactly where a letter has to be. So in this case, we know exactly where Dammion was, and the theory has to fit around that because that's the immovable evidence in this case. And a lot of the theories that one of the theories that we discuss later on, I think it's difficult to fit that particular video into some of the theories that we've been hearing about. Let's keep going then, because there is more. When the Denver Police Department reviewed the case, they came to the conclusion that this was a suicide, developing 17 bullet points to support that conclusion. First of all, Brett, the fact that they developed 17 bullet points to support this conclusion, I find is definitely it's more work than I've seen in a lot of police reports. I think that's incredible that they came up with so many reasons to support their conclusion. In many reports, I don't see this much detail. So what I'm trying to say is I think they did a pretty thorough review and really thought about all the points. And one of the points that they included for supporting the conclusion that this was a death by suicide is that Dammion's phone was disassembled. The Denver Police Department felt it was unclear why a killer would do this, and Dammion's DNA was the only one on the phone. It would make sense that someone who is going to kill themselves would destroy a means of communication. In fact, this is fairly common in a situation where someone takes their own life. Furthermore, there was no struggle, which seems unlikely if this were a murder, as we've already talked about with the lack of injuries to Dammion's body. And in taking this into account and many other bullet points, Denver concluded that it had, quote, no reservation that this was a suicide.
Yeah, and I think Gunnison, they wanted Denver to look at this to avoid what you hear a lot, which is small town, protecting the college, protecting the wrestlers, whatever, some sort of corruption. They probably had all sorts of reasons to cover it up. I mean, you hear this all the time, right? I mean, it's true crime. We hear this all the time. And I think they wanted somebody to come in, bigger police department that has no skin in the game, and take a look at this. And some of these points are great. I mean, the phone was disassembled. There's no reason for a killer to do this. You can come up with reasons, but they don't actually make any sense. You're going to stage the suicide. You want the body to be found. Disassembling the phone doesn't make any sense. If you leave the phone, then eventually somebody's going to ping the phone, they're going to find the car, and they're going to find the body. And you want that to happen if you stage the body. That's the whole reason you staged it in the first place. Disassembling the phone, if you're the killer, just raises questions. It just makes people ask questions, as they have. But the fact of the matter is, you actually see this it's not uncommon. Alice mentioned this. It's not uncommon. A lot of times people will do things like send a final text message and then destroy their phone because they want to say goodbye, but they know you can use the phone to find them. And you don't want to hear back from the person you just texted. You don't want to hear their arguments. You don't want them to call you in the middle of it. It's kind of like what we were talking about with Tori. If you've really made up your mind and you don't want to be talked out of it, you're going to avoid that kind of conversation. You don't want to have that kind of conversation. So it makes sense that you would disassemble the phone. Moreover, if you're the murderer and you disassemble it, it's just more area you could leave evidence on. And so the police looked at the phone because they were like, hey, if it is a killer, maybe we'll find something. And the only DNA they found was Dammion's. A couple of the other points that we didn't mention but are important. There's no evidence anywhere around the scene that there was anyone else there with Dammion. Now, people have pointed out there was snow on the ground. There's reasons that maybe you wouldn't see evidence of anybody else. That's fine. But nevertheless, the fact remains there is no evidence of another person. And that difficulty here, the whole absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Well, actually, it is. It actually is. If there's no evidence that someone was there, that's evidence no one was there. Doesn't mean no one was there. Maybe someone was, and they just managed to leave no trace of themselves. But it was something the Denver police thought was pretty significant. And, once again, what does Denver have to lose? What do they have to prove?
And here's the thing. I know a lot of people think, oh, but a very savvy killer will know the steps to take in order not to leave any DNA behind. Kind of, but not necessarily, because we have such advanced techniques now for identifying DNA. You may know to wear gloves so you don't leave fingerprints behind. You may know to wipe down a phone. But remember, fingerprints are not always visible to the naked eye. So you may think you have wiped something clean, but in fact, there's something, half of a fingerprint left behind. You can't necessarily control all your hair. That's not just on your head, but on the rest of your body, your arm hair, your leg hair. If you have a beard, mustache, facial hair, anything like that can fall out without you knowing it. And then, of course, your skin cells. If you scrape yourself against a door as you're exiting and you leave behind some of your DNA or your blood that way, or you sneeze in the car, your saliva's there, So even though I hear a lot of people who kind of like the CSI effect, they're like, well, now we all know how to not leave DNA behind. The truth of the matter is it's really hard to leave no trace of you behind. And that's why, Brett, there's a lot of truth in what you just said, which is, no evidence of someone there is evidence of no one there, right? And so it's not impossible to go into a situation and leave no DNA there, but it's actually much harder than a lot of people think.
And this is why we talk about stories, because sometimes I feel like when you talk about cases like this, you sort of just throw information out there, but you never tie it together into a coherent narrative. And at the end of the day, if someone murdered this person, there is a narrative. There's a story of how it went down, right? And remember, if he was murdered, if Dammion was murdered, it's pretty clear this wasn't the Zodiac killer. He wasn't killed by some super sophisticated person. The theory is that he was killed by a bunch of drunk college kids, right? I mean, that's the theory. The theory is that a bunch of drunk kids who had just spent all night partying and had gotten mad at him and somehow killed him without leaving any mark on him now have to cover it up while being drunk and get it set up, we know, by early Sunday morning, because that's when his body's seen. That's how they have to do this. And you're telling me that they're leaving no evidence of their presence? That's hard to believe. That's hard to believe. But that's the story you have to believe if you think this is a murder. Now look, we've spent most of this episode up to this point telling you all the reasons to think this is a suicide. Now we're going to talk about the biggest piece of evidence that this is a murder and whether or not this evidence holds up, and that's Linda Nienhauser's account of what she saw on that Sunday. We'll start with the white truck. As you may recall, Linda Nienhauser, who is a perfectly believable witness, she's a member of the local government, she's coming down to the trail, she's actually there, her child had been killed, and one of the things she would do is every year around that time, she would go down to sort of remember them and pay tribute to them, and she liked to do this around this time on this trail. So the whole reason she's there, she's going to go down the trail, she's going to sort of meditate in this beautiful spot, and then she's going to come back. Something she does. So that's why she's come out there that Sunday. When she gets there, she sees Dammion's car, which is parked at the head of the trail, which is almost certainly where it remained the entire time until his body was found. She also sees, sitting next to his car, next to his SUV, a white truck with a camper. Now, this is basically all she can say about this. If you read her statement, she basically says, I wish I could remember literally anything else about the truck. Is it an old truck? Is it a new truck? What kind of truck is it? She doesn't remember any of that. Literally, all she remembers is it's a white truck, which is probably the most common color for a truck, with a camper on it, camper back over the bed, which in Colorado is basically every white truck. But that's all she remembers. So we're going to go with that. Except she remembers that it has a breast cancer ribbon on the license plate. And this becomes really important for the police. The police want to find this truck. They want to talk to whoever is driving it. They obviously can't look at every white truck in Colorado and the surrounding area. They just can't do that. So they narrow in on this breast cancer plate, but they can't find any white truck that fits this description that has the breast cancer plate that would have been anywhere near Gunnison, Colorado at the time. Now, some people have said that a member of Kyle Piot's family owned a similar vehicle, but it did not have the breast cancer ribbon on the license plate, and Linda was adamant about this. Now, some people have said, well, maybe it wasn't a plate. Maybe it was just one of the plastic things that goes around it. And even Linda now has kind of said that too. All these years later, she's kind of like, well, maybe it was one of those things. Well, this car owned by Kyle's family didn't have that either. Now, maybe you'd say, well, maybe they took it off. But why would they do that? Because once again, they don't know that this is the one thing that Linda has zeroed in on. But the biggest problem here is that Linda's account of this truck is just so vague. I mean, it's a stretch to even say that someone in Kyle's family has a similar truck just because they have a white truck with a camper. That's it. And because her description of the vehicle is not any more detailed, it's basically impossible for the police to ever figure out who it was who was driving that truck that had parked there at the trail that day. And that's unfortunate because it'd be great if we could talk to that person.
Yeah, Brett. And again, we talk about direct and circumstantial evidence and how direct evidence is faulty because people have faulty memories. And especially in this case, Linda didn't know she was seeing anything of any significance. And in fact, she says that she tried not to look in that direction very hard because she thought she was being watched. And so you have Linda, who didn't know she was supposed to be taking note of anything, and so therefore she didn't really have much more description to give police, and her memory could be faulty from what she actually saw. If she actually saw a truck, for example, if she actually saw a white truck, for example, or that breast cancer plate, it's a big state. Even though if this town is small, it's a big state with a lot of people coming and going for these outdoor hiking trails, and it's just difficult to make use of this particular information without more detail. Now, if they came in with someone who they thought was a suspected killer and they could tie this suspected killer to the scene in other ways, other eyewitnesses, DNA, security camera footage, cell phone records, what have you, and then it happened that this person also had a white truck, then Linda's description paired with other corroborating information could become helpful to corroborate a theory or to corroborate, police's probable cause to seek some sort of charging instrument. But standalone, there's not much more we can do with this. And it's frustrating, but we face this oftentimes where we have good bits of information that are just too vague in and of themselves, and we put them into a bucket of, well, maybe it can come useful later as corroborating information when we have more pieces of the puzzle. And that's where we are now, which is that it's an interesting fact, but standalone, it's not very valuable. We've talked a lot about what Linda said. Let's talk more about her account of what she saw, because the strongest evidence of murder is the account of Linda from her time on that trail. To briefly recap, the day after Dammion disappeared, Linda reported that when she arrived at the trail where Dammion's body would be found, there was a white truck parked near his SUV. After walking on the trail, she happened to glance up to the cliffside where Dammion's body would be found. When she did, she thought she saw two people. One was someone standing with their back to her, wearing a camouflage jacket, and the other person was squatting next to him, looking at her through binoculars. The combination of being startled when she thought she was alone and the person staring at her through binoculars made Linda avert her gaze. She hurried to her vehicle and left, only thinking about it again when Dammion's body was found. If this story is accurate, it's important for a number of reasons. First, it shows that Dammion was already dead by Sunday morning. Any sightings of his car and him or his use of his meal card were either incorrect or have an explanation other than Dammion using them. Second, it strongly indicates that someone else was involved in Dammion's death. No one has ever reported finding Dammion's body, and it is highly unlikely that a random person would come upon his body and not report anything about it, having found a dead body. It's not impossible, of course, but it's incredibly unlikely. If nothing else, it would prove that someone else found his body before the police. They could have removed or disturbed evidence or seen something important. But if they exist, we need to find them, and so far, no one has come forward.
Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit last time. It's possible somebody found his body, took things like his money or his earrings or whatever, and just didn't report it. That is possible. It's not outside the realm of possibility. But it is unlikely. If there was someone with his body that morning and they didn't report it, you got to think that's your best evidence of a murder. That's your best evidence of staging. Seems pretty clear that Linda saw a vehicle. We talked about that a lot. But did she actually see someone else? I mean, that is the ultimate question. And this is where I think you really have to think about the value and the problems with witness testimony. And let's think about the way Linda describes what she saw. First, Linda's description of Dammion is fairly detailed. I mean, she mentions the fact he's wearing this camouflage jacket, but there's no question that she saw him from a distance. And we know for a fact that when she saw him, she did not realize that he was hanging. She did not see the red jumper cable that he was hanging from. She did not see the orange sleeping bag that was partially unrolled next to his body. And in fact, she thought it was weird because she thought he was looking at her and his feet were facing the wrong direction. And in fact, he wasn't. His back was to her. Now, people try and mess with this to figure out how is this possible. And some people have speculated that the jumper cables and maybe even the sleeping bag were added after she left. But that doesn't make any sense at all. First, if someone staged the murder and originally hanged Dammion with the black jumper cables, which might blend in and she might not notice, why would they then switch out the jumper cables with the red pair? There's no obvious reason to do this. And the more you tamper with the body, the more likely it is that you're going to leave evidence behind and the police are going to recognize staging, neither of which happened. Second, according to Linda's story, and this is so important, the person would have been there when she arrived at 10 a.m. She gets there at 10 a.m. She goes for this walk down the path. She ends up at the end of the path. She's meditating. She is there for 4 hours. So this person who was there before she got there at 10 would still be there at 2 p.m. 4 hours later. That's 4 hours at least to hang Dammion's body, to do whatever staging's necessary, and then get out of there. And yet, under this theory and some other theories, even then the person would not have unfurled the sleeping bag. And the assumption is if Linda didn't see it, it wasn't there, which she looked at it for a few seconds. And they would not yet have hanged Dammion with the red jumper cables. So they're hanging out there for 4 hours. What are they doing? All of that seems incredibly unlikely. More likely is that even though anyone who looked for any amount of time would have noticed the red jumper cables and the bright orange sleeping bag, Linda didn't notice because she averted her eyes so quickly, as even she says. By her own account, Linda only looked in Dammion's direction for a few seconds at most. She was embarrassed because she'd also been singing as she's walking down the trail. She's unnerved because in this brief glance up at this, what turns out to be a body, she believes she also sees someone watching her. And as we've noted, the initial time she saw Dammion, she was far enough away that she actually thought he was staring at her, when in fact she was looking at his back.
Yeah, Brett, I mean, the fact that Linda herself is giving reasons for us to question how clearly she saw things is very important here. She herself is admitting that she looks away quickly, that she's not thinking about this. This is a meditative time for her, but it would be huge for a killer to hang around for no good reason for 4 hours. That's 4 hours for other people to spot you, for people to see your car there, for people to find Damien's body. There are just so many problems with sticking around the scene. Oftentimes we see perpetrators try and spend as little time as they can at the scene of the crime for the very reason that we've discussed. You stay longer, more DNA, more evidence is left behind, more chance of being seen, especially on this public trail during daylight. The risk is just incredibly high of being seen. So I think that is something that stands out to me the most about Linda's account, is that she sees the car at the beginning and also at the end of her trip, which is 4 full hours.
I mean, think about Delphi, right? I mean, Delphi is a killing where the killer clearly, at least in our view, had planned this, had thought about this, was excited to do it. This was the culmination of a lot of things for him. And he committed that crime and was out of there in a very brief period of time. He did whatever staging was done, and we know there was some staging. He did that. He took care of that, and he got out in really just a matter of minutes. This case, you have to believe, this is not somebody who wanted to kill Dammion, or even if they did, it was not that kind of murder. And yet, under this theory, when exactly did Dammion die? How long had he been dead? Because if he died much earlier in the night, then it's even longer that this person has been out there with the body. And now, the noontime sun is beating down on them in the wide open where anybody could see them, and they're just hanging out. And I'm not saying staging a body doesn't take some time. It doesn't take this long.
Yeah, and in fact, when Linda spoke to the police a week after the event, she seemed to no longer believe she'd seen a second person. She would tell the police that she didn't think she actually saw a person with binoculars, and in fact, she didn't think anyone else was there. Linda noted that the person with the binoculars never moved. She also noted that the second time she looked back, she only saw Dammion. She didn't see the second person. Is it possible that she was mistaken? In fact, that's just what the police thought. Police noticed that combination of snow and dark rocks near Dammion's body could be mistaken for a person crouched down looking through binoculars. The fact this person never moved as they seemed to stare at Dammion only helped to reinforce this theory. And we think about everything logically. It doesn't really make sense that a person would have been with Dammion. The most logical theory is that whatever happened to Dammion happened late Saturday night, early Sunday morning. And if Dammion was attacked and strangled to death, it would have occurred in that time frame, kind of in the dark of night. Whatever Linda saw or didn't see, she certainly saw Dammion that day at around 2 p.m. This would have been as much as 12 hours after Dammion was killed. It was 4 hours after Linda arrived, and both Dammion's car and the white truck were already at the scene by that time. And so this means that if a suicide was being staged, it was already well underway by the time she pulled up. And yet we're expected to believe that this person, the second person, is leisurely hanging around the dead body on a trail that, while not traveled often, is still used as evidenced by Linda's arrival.
And look, I think it's worth noting that if this person existed, they would have seen Linda first in plenty of time to whip out a pair of binoculars that they just so happened to bring and stare at her. Binoculars. Been a long time since I used binoculars. I mean, if you're sort of an outdoorsy person, maybe you have binoculars for bird watching or whatnot. In this theory, these rando college kids would have had binoculars that they just so happened to take to the body staging. They see Linda coming down the trail, and they get their binoculars out to look at her. But this makes no sense. Why would someone in the process of staging a body leave themselves open to being seen by another person? They don't need to see Linda. They don't need to stare her down. They could hide. That would probably be the smart thing to do. And in fact, if this person was involved in murdering Dammion, there's almost certainly another person somewhere who's hiding, because this is the kind of crime that would have taken at least 2 people to handle, unless you think Dammion drove out to this spot to meet someone who then murdered him and did so without leaving a mark on him or any sign of struggle. You think this person or these people brought Dammion and his car to that spot. There are 2 vehicles there. The person who came there had to leave somehow. That means there are at least two people involved. One to drive Dammion's car, one to drive the white truck, assuming the white truck's involved, and then the two people would presumably leave in the same vehicle. So you got one person who's hiding somewhere, and then you got Mr. Binoculars who's standing out here next to a dead body, out in the open, staring at this woman for no apparent reason. And you got to ask yourself, why would this person do this? It's going to undermine the entire purpose of staging the body. Given the distance, it would have been easy for this person to simply hide from Linda, crouching next to a dead body and exposing themselves. It just doesn't make any sense at all. And I think given everything about this scenario, look, maybe there was somebody there next to Dammion with binoculars watching Linda, silent and still as a statue. That's possible. Or maybe it was just some rocks. And when Linda looked up, she saw two people staring at her. And in fact, she didn't see any people staring at her because the rocks weren't staring at her and Dammion was facing the other way. Even in death, he was facing the other way, not towards her. Most likely, Linda's just seeing things.
So we've gone through a lot, and I think in this third episode you're seeing where we are leaning, but let's talk about the theories because we have reached that point in the episode. Really, there are two possible theories in this case. Either it was murder or it was suicide. So let's talk about the theory of this is a murder first. What evidence do we have pointing to murder? The first is that the track team decided to get revenge on Dammion for jumping their teammate. They tracked him down late that night and jumped him, though they would have done so in a way that did not cause any injuries to Dammion. Instead of beating him, they strangled him. But now they had a problem. They needed to get rid of the body. They drove Dammion out to the trail, hanging him by his own jumper cables, and they did so without leaving any evidence of their presence. So that's one possibility where he's murdered by basically someone he's angered that night, and they're staging a suicide. Alternatively, the wrestling team was upset that Dammion had ruined their reputation and wanted to teach him a lesson. Maybe someone put him in a headlock for too long and he died of asphyxiation. Then they panicked and they decided to cover it up. For both of these, it had to have happened after Dammion left the wrestling house and went and got gas because of that timestamp video we talked about. So let's talk about the wrestling team theory of murder. You would have to believe that everyone cooled down. They pulled Dammion back to, the back of the house, told him to cool down, chastised him, but then he sat back there under a blanket, texting and talking to people for quite some time where everyone's emotions had cooled to the point where he left the house. No one followed him. No one was in the car with him when he was seen at the gas station. And so the wrestlers let him leave, didn't give him any threatening texts, didn't talk to him in a threatening way, but quite literally let him lay on the floor for quite some time before letting him leave. And then once he had gotten away, either tracked down Dammion or for some reason Dammion came back to the house where he had been so embarrassed and saddened by the shame he'd brought onto his wrestling team. It just seems like if the wrestling team were going to execute this murder plan, they would have done it very close in time to when emotions were still running high earlier in the night, not later on when everyone's kind of mellowed out and the drama of earlier that evening had time to dissipate.
And they did all this incredibly late at night, right? I mean, we're talking 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning when this would have had to have happened. And you mentioned luring him back to the house unless he came of his own volition. And they did so without using any phones. They didn't text him and say, hey, man, we need to have a wrestling meeting. Come back to the house. Like, that didn't happen. And you have to believe that Dammion, I guess he just decided at 1:40 in the morning, I'm laying here. I've taken a bunch of LSD, I smoked some marijuana, I drank a lot of beer, but I really need gas. So I'm going to walk to my dorm at 2 o'clock in the morning, pick up my car, go get some gas, and then just come back here to the house. I'm not going to go anywhere. I just want to make sure I have gas in my car. I mean, that just makes no sense. It is completely insane to think that's what happened. And, if you walk through the evidence here for murder, I mean, what is it? What is the evidence of murder that we have here? I mean, we have the dining card getting used, him getting signed into some classrooms. You got people seeing his car driving around. And I'm being very broad when I say evidence of murder. These are just the evidence of weird things. I'll put it that way. People seeing his car. The fact that people were angry about him. The fact that some of the statements by some of the people aren't necessarily entirely correct. Some of them are wrong about the time. Some of them overstate or understate how angry people were when all this happened. The sighting by Linda, big one, obviously. She saw a car there, and she saw what she thought was another person. And if that's an accurate statement, that's a huge one. There's all sorts of reasons not to think it is. Now, some people are like, well, there was a car there, so surely that person knew. Linda wouldn't have seen this body unless she just happened to look up. She just happened to look in that direction is the only reason she saw Dammion's body, and she did not realize it was a body. There's no telling how many people saw Dammion's body on that trail in the 3 or 4 days between when he was hanged and when he was found and had no idea and went on about their lives and have no idea that anyone died there. I mean, that it could have happened that whoever's in that white truck was driving through Colorado and decided they had a few dirt bikes or mountain bikes. They're going to take a ride down this trail. It was beautiful. They had a good time. They had a little picnic off by the side. They came back to their truck. They drove off, and they have no idea this happened. They have no idea that their truck is the subject of all this speculation. No idea. And that could have happened for a lot of people. So that's what you got. You've got some unusual sightings, some unusual activities, some missing things. We talked about the earrings. We talked about the money, which may or may not be missing. Linda sighting. That's about it. That's about all you've got when you want to build a murder case here. And then sort of the idea. And this is the big one. That's the concrete stuff. But what's the big one? Why do people actually think this might be murder? Because they say there's no way Dammion would have committed suicide. And you hear that a lot. You hear that from his dad. You hear that from his wrestling coach. And I totally understand struggling with that idea. I do not blame his dad at all for wanting more answers and wanting more clarity. That makes 100% sense to me. I will say this about his wrestling coach. His high school wrestling coach said some things which I think he just has a misperception here. I mean, he talked about how mentally tough Dammion was and how he was one of the toughest guys he ever knew. And that he just didn't think he would commit suicide. And I just feel like that is the entirely wrong way to look at this. If Dammion died by suicide, it wasn't a matter of weakness. It wasn't because he wasn't mentally tough anymore. It's because he was struggling with a disease that is depression that made him do something entirely irrational at a time when he had everything in front of him and he just needed to see that or to talk to the right person or whatever. But in that moment, he couldn't see it. That's what happened if it's suicide. It's not weakness. It's not weakness any more than if he'd broken his leg and he couldn't walk on it. I mean, it's a weird thing we do with mental health. We act like if you just rub some dirt on it, it'll be okay, right? And we don't do that. If you got shot, nobody would be like, man, you're just laying over there bleeding. You need to get up. Nobody does that, right? But when it's mental health, we act like that's the way it is. And it's not. And I feel like there's some of that happening here with people who they just can't comprehend that someone with this bright future and this happy guy and with everything in front of him would succumb to these suicidal thoughts. But I think if you look at that night, you can kind of see how it happened. I mean, Dammion, he'd been acting erratically in the days leading up to his death. He's in the throes of depression because this girl that he's in love with, he's broken up with her and he can't get back together with her. Now she's with somebody else, and not just anybody, but another athlete, somebody he has to see all the time, somebody who he thought of as a friend. His ex-girlfriend has said he was already struggling with depression even before they broke up. One of his other close friends we talked about is telling the police that multiple times he had talked to her about these suicidal thoughts that he was having, and really the only thing he had that made him happy was wrestling. That was everything for him. And then on this night, the night where he probably died, he gets into a fight over his ex-girlfriend. He embarrasses himself in front of everybody. He embarrasses his team. He embarrasses his best friend, Kyle, who's also the captain of the wrestling team. Also, by the way, he punches his hand into the ground so hard that he thinks he may have broken it. What ended his freshman wrestling season? An injury that he had been working really hard to come back from so he could make another run his sophomore year. You know, you got a broken hand, that's going to hurt your ability to wrestle. Wrestling's one of those things where, grappling's an important part. Who knows what effect that was having on his mind. And it's just not hard to see how all of this could spiral into this sort of suicidal situation, especially given that we know that he had taken both marijuana and LSD that night. And it's not that the LSD or the marijuana caused him to commit suicide. It's not that at all. It's that combined with everything else going on in his life, maybe they could have contributed to it, particularly if you think that he had taken them earlier in the night, and then right around this time when everything seems to be spiraling out of control, he's actually coming off of them, right? He's not in the euphoria anymore. He's actually like coming back into reality at the same time that all this other bad stuff is falling down upon him. And I think if you just look at all that and you put it all together and you compare it to what you have pointing to this as some sort of murder conspiracy, I think this is just a tragic case when, unfortunately, this young man who had everything going for him, really did, nevertheless sort of succumb to this. And that at the end of the day, this was a death caused by suicide.
Brett, I think what you say is likely what happened, that Dammion was not murdered, but rather ended his own life. And I think what you said is so important. I hope people hear it. We are not doing Dammion any service by trying to say that something that likely did not happen to him, a murder, happened. I think it's much more powerful in honoring his life and everyone who remembers and loves him by recognizing what likely happened here and recognizing that if in fact he had ended his own life, it was not a sign of weakness, like you said, Brett, not at all. And I can't even imagine the pain that his father, his family, and his loved ones are going through in seeing that reality, but in seeing that Dammion is exactly who they describe. He was this happy and exciting and love for life kind of guy. He can be that and be someone who suffered from mental illness, whether it was diagnosed or not. And in no way does that diminish the happy and joyful and full of life person that he was. In no way does that take away from any of that. It is an aspect of who he was, and tragically, I think it was what led to the end of his life. But I do not think it takes away from the life that he did lead up until that point, as tragic and as sad as it is to face what likely happened to him in the end. And if you know anyone like Dammion who seemingly is so happy and would never take that step into ending their own life, I think you wouldn't be alone. Many people who struggle with these thoughts seem perfectly happy on the outside, and that's why it is in fact so difficult for loved ones to recognize a problem or for them to find the help that they need. And Dammion here, I want everyone to remember, all the things that his father describes him as is still true, even if he did end up taking his own life in the end. Those things are not in tension with each other. The great man that he was before is still just as true, no matter how his life ended.
And I just want to say this. I don't know what the statistics are, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that most people struggle with some form of depression at some point in their life, or with some form of mental illness at some point in their life. Many people have thoughts of suicide, and if you're out there listening and you're struggling with something like that, the first thing I want to say is you will never walk alone. There are people who love you. There are people you can talk to. I do want to give the suicide hotline number, 1-800-273-8255. There are people who can talk to you, who are professionals, who can work through things. If you don't want to talk to those people, you can talk to us. We're not professionals, but we will talk to any of you at any time about anything. We are 100% here for you all the time. We have people who reach out to us that has nothing to do with true crime. People just want to talk about various things, and we are happy to hear from those people. And if you're one of those people, we want to hear from you, because whatever is going on in your life, there was a time when it wasn't going on, and there will be a time in the future when it's not going on anymore. So we just all got to get through this together, basically, is what I'm saying. At the end of the day, we just all got to get through this together, because that's the only way we're going to make it through. And this is a tragic case, but I think what we can do when we're remembering Dammion is we can remember him the way Alice said, the great kid he was that brought joy to so many people. And if he helps other people get through their own depression or get through their own thoughts of suicide, I mean, what better legacy can he have? So I know this was a tough case, but it was an important one, and I'm glad we covered it. Interested to hear what you guys think. If you think we're wrong about this, about the outcome here, would love to hear your arguments. Email us prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Obviously, we're on YouTube. We have a website, prosecutorspodcast.com. There's all sorts of ways to get in touch with us. Look us up on Facebook, on the gallery. We'll be talking about this case and all kinds of other cases, and I am 100% serious. You guys can write us about anything. We are always happy to hear from you, and we're always happy to talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. Well, Alice, is there anything else you want to add before we sign off?
No, Brett, I think you've said it all incredibly well, and our emails are open to you, and so is that hotline. So thank you guys for joining us on this ride. I think it was an important case to look into, and I know it's also something that affects a lot more people than just Dammion and his loved ones. So let us know what you think, and if you have recommendations for cases, you can also write that email. We're happy to add it to the list. That's how we come up with our case list from all of you. That's right. That's why we're covering this case, is because somebody suggested it. Got another case coming up next week, which was also recommended by somebody. So we listen to you guys, and we want to cover the cases that you want to hear. We will be back next week with that case. It's an interesting one and an important one, and I think you're all going to enjoy it. But until then, I'm Brett. And I'm Alice. And we are the Prosecutors. Podcast called Lost in Larrimah, which is another Australian podcast. Ooh. And we have this joke. I go down a lot of rabbit holes, as you may know. And there's this conspiracy that Australia does not exist. What? Wait, like actual people think that? Well, yeah, I mean... We don't live in the backward days. Like, people can go there themselves to see. You think you can. How do you know you're going to Australia? You could be going somewhere else. You only know that because you think it's true. But it could not be true. I mean, couldn't that be true? Just because it says on your little plane that you're going to Australia doesn't mean you're going to Australia. You could be going anywhere.
So there's this whole conspiracy theory that Australia is not real. And so whenever we're listening to something like Lost in Laramie, we're always, the joke is, this is not real. Australia cannot be real. And anyway, I'm not going to give it away.
Is it good?
But if you listen to it, you'll
Lost in Laramie?
Lost in Laramie.
Okay, I'll listen to it.
All this month, stream the funniest films for free on Pluto TV. Watch comedy classics like Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy, and Mean Girls. Or drop in for a Tyler Perry marathon with a Medea family funeral and Medea's witness protection. Pluto TV also has hundreds of channels and thousands of movies and TV shows like Get Shorty, Be Cool, Key and Peele, Comedy in Color, and more. And no contracts, no subscriptions, no fees, no joke. So download the Pluto TV app on your favorite streaming device and start laughing today. Pluto TV, drop in, watch free.